What did you think of the president of Mexico at the G7 summit in Canada this week?
Well, the first thing that I thought was, what on earth is Mexico doing at the G7 summit, given that Mexico is not a G7 country? But beyond that, I particularly enjoyed the picture of all the male heads of state looking at President Sheinbaum and her enjoying it very much, I feel.
I think so. It's a weird moment for Mexican international affairs because after, I'd say, about 6 years of isolationism, Claudia Sheinbaum goes out into the world and embraces this attention. She's Mexico's first woman president. She wants to make Mexico a presence globally. And it's made her a really, really famous figure in international affairs. Everyone knows the name Sheinbaum, as they say here. And yet, I would like to argue, Tavo, and that's the purpose of this podcast today, that she isn't the most famous Mexican in the world, even right now.
Yeah, and I think that's the tricky thing, right? Because Claudia Sheinbaum was, outside of Mexico at least, relatively unknown up until a few years ago. Even like when it was, quite apparent that she was going to be the next presidential candidate, and given the power of Morena, the de facto next president of Mexico, she wasn't really known at all. So she's become quite famous, but I think this is only the past year.
She wasn't even famous in Mexico. I've long criticized her illegal pre-campaign, where she used Mexico City funds, also known as my tax pesos, to travel around the country on, euphemistically called meetings and seminars, where she'd actually just be campaigning, because people literally had no idea who she was. She was the mayor of Mexico City, but she was a pretty obscure person. She had previously been the former President López Obrador's environment secretary when he'd been mayor of Mexico City. And having a look at the ranking of most powerful positions in government in Mexico, the very last one, or the penultimate one, is always the environment secretary. So she was really not a famous person, even in Mexico. And now she's a world-known name. And yet she's not famous at all compared to the other people we're about to talk to. Now, just for our listeners, what Tavo and I have agreed on is that today, instead of having a nice, not a script, but a bit of working notes that we have to talk about to know what we're going to talk about throughout the podcast, we've kept our notes secret from each other. So I have no idea what Tavo's going to say. Tavo has no idea what I'm going to say. And we've each got 3 famous people who we think are the most famous people in the world that come from Mexico.
And that is the most famous people in Mexico today, right? So there's a bunch of people who were very famous in Mexico 30 years ago, 60 years ago, even 10 years ago. But Mexico and the world has changed significantly in recent years. And I think the list of the most famous people keeps changing every day. So there's a list of the people who are famous today, not the people who probably were famous 10 years ago, or the people that should be famous.
Now we're going to get into a really interesting conversation, I think, because I think lots of the people who are famous today, or have been, say, over the past 5 years, I believe have been famous at least on and off over the past decade or something like that. So I think we can dive straight into it. But like in my view, see if you agree with this, it's the breadth and the depth of fame, right? So it's the breadth, as in like you can't just be really, really famous in Mexico. You do have to be known abroad, right? This is an English language podcast about Mexico, so clearly they have to be famous at least in English-speaking countries. But also has to be the depth, right? You have to be famous amongst a lot of people. So you can't just be a very famous person amongst academics all around the world. You have to be beloved on the world stage on a broad basis.
And maybe not beloved, but definitely well-known, I think is a key footnote there. And I think something I'd add there is, or I'd emphasize, is it's all over the world, right? There's a lot of people who are very, very famous, Mexicans who are very famous in Latin America. Think pop stars, for example, or telenovela artists. They might also be famous in the US, but no one in the rest of the world will know about them. Whereas the idea here is who is famous worldwide and comes from Mexico.
I disagree there slightly.
Or at least that's the way I've thought about it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's have a look. I think we might overlap, but I've got some pretty interesting stories as to why these people are famous, and they're almost never what you expect. So let's dive in.
So, Alex, get us started. Who's number one on your list?
Well, number one is in number three, you mean, because it's the third most famous person. I think you're going to be shocked by this. I've sort of cheated to see, because I wanted to have some sort of data that backed me up on this. And the third most famous person from Mexico at the moment, or over the past 5 years, is not Mexico's former president, López Obrador, even though he's loved here by many. Because he was such an isolationist, lots of people had no idea who he was and still have no idea who he is abroad. The third most famous person in Mexico, I think, is Frida Kahlo. The third, not the first. What do you think of that?
I have her as my number one, actually.
I'm sure you did. I bet that you would. But I thought I'd bring a bit of context for this, because the Frida Kahlo story to me is incredible. Of course, she's got the most breadth, I'd say. So she's most well known by most people around the world, but it's sort of like a skin deep fame for a really unexpected reason. I wonder if you've done a bit of the research that I've done. So just a very brief history of Frida Kahlo. She was born in the first decade of the 20th century, middle-class Mexican, marries Diego Rivera, the great Mexican revolutionary muralist, and that's kind of why she's known. During her entire life, she was a relatively well-known artist, but she was an artist's artist. Really, the famous guy was her husband. She died in 1954, being relatively unknown. And what happens is, from the 1980s onwards, you get this sort of new wave of feminism coming in. She becomes a prominent figure. You've got the Salma Hayek movie in the early 2000s. And yet, the real boom in Frida Kahlo's fame comes in the year 2006. But I bet you can't guess why, Tavo.
I have no idea, because I read about a set of exhibitions of her work that happened in the Tate Modern, that happened in the US as well, but they weren't in 2006. I'm keen to hear this.
Exactly. So one of the interesting things that happens the year before is that, well, a lot of people are going to say, well, it's in 2007, it's her anniversary, 100th birthday. But no, what happened in 2005 is far more important, because her family, the heirs to her image, sell the Frida Kahlo brand to a company. And that company is called the Frida Kahlo Corporation. It's Panamanian-owned, Florida-based, and they are the epitome of just the brand-driven company. And they have one piece of real estate, and that is the Frida Kahlo face, name, eyebrow, you name it. And so they spent, in the lead up to her 100th anniversary, a whole bunch of money to promote her image all around the world. Millions of dollars. Because they knew that if they could get that money back, she was already quite famous by then, right? Like, it's not that they created Frida Kahlo, but they wanted to not only ride the wave, but boost it. And you can see it on the Google Trends, this enormous peak in the year 2007, which is her anniversary, but it starts way before, and it doesn't go down as much as it did before. So what you've got is this Frida Kahlo Corporation that isn't Mexican, really pushing her image, but also very keen to make money. And so they do the most anti-Frida Kahlo thing in the world. Remember that Frida Kahlo was a communist. She was a left-wing icon in Mexico City in this post-revolutionary world. And what the Frida Kahlo Corporation does is they will hunt down any person who's selling Frida Kahlo toys, puts Frida Kahlo images on their websites, all this sort of stuff. They will hunt them down and sue them for the royalties.
That's something that's extraordinary to me. How can it be that the face of a person can be then privatized by a third party? Like, not even, because my understanding was that the company, or the rights to everything that she made, had passed on to her niece. And I knew this company existed, but I thought the niece was still involved. So even then, I don't know how the niece could control the image of her aunt.
You've hit the nail on the head. The niece owns 49% of the stake. The Frida Kahlo Corporation owns 51%. So they can do whatever they want. And I think they were okay with that because they were probably making some good money until the Frida Kahlo Corporation did what corporations do, which is it went too far. In 2018, because for some reason they were okay with like the Frida Kahlo Corporation going into like literal communist websites where they're just talking about communism and like the role of Frida Kahlo in the communist history, and the corporation asking the communists to pay up for using the image of their icon, which I think is just chef's kiss. But in 2018, what happens is that the Frida Kahlo Corporation makes a deal with the most obvious thing they would have done. It's the most obvious thing I think a company would do if you had an icon like Frida Kahlo. They sign a deal with Mattel. And Mattel makes a Frida Kahlo Barbie. And that
of course they do.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back, apparently, for the family, because they said Frida Kahlo is like the anti-Barbie. Frida Kahlo is not a Barbie. She was a woman who was in enormous pain a lot of her life. She was a disabled person because of the terrible injuries she sustained as a young woman. She died relatively young because of that. She lived in this artistic community and made a lot of art on the basis of her face. Yes, a lot of people sort of say, she became famous because millennials are self-obsessed and she's the queen of selfies. I mean, maybe, but actually there's a lot of pain and a lot of depth in her art. But what's interesting is it was the Barbie that really triggered the family. And so they're still, I believe, in a legal battle, an ongoing legal battle that started in the year 2018 with the Frida Kahlo Barbie. And
you can't have your cake and eat it too. I mean, you decided to privatize the image of a person, and now they're using that image as they're want to do, and now you're throwing a tantrum because this is too far. I'm sorry, but I think Frida Kahlo was probably rolling in her grave way before, when there were little notebooks of her being sold world over exclusively to make profit. I mean, I think she would have been probably upset even if that was happening, to then give the money away to charity. But this was not going to charity.
Yeah, exactly. I think ultimately it's just as the family will only have $100 bills to dab their tears away as they see this beloved icon become consumed by capitalism, basically. But that's my number 3, not because she's not famous, but because since 2006 and onwards, her image has declined slightly. She's become unfashionable. I think we saw a bit too much of Frida Kahlo. She became infamous to a certain extent, where people said, I'm kind of sick of seeing this person, because she became this hashtag feminist, hashtag selfie icon, which again, was probably completely against her vision of what women's liberation and what her sort of self-portraits actually meant. But people have sort of lost interest in her. You wouldn't think that if you go to Coyoacán and see the Frida Kahlo house, which is now a museum, and you have to buy tickets months in advance because you can't just turn up and go in like most museums. But she is, I think, the 3rd most famous Mexican on the basis of the past 5 years and on the statistics I've seen.
It's interesting that you say that, because, I mean, I think what's definitely happened is that she's become less relevant amongst, the general public, which to your point fits into the why she's not maybe the most famous Mexican anymore. But I think she will always, given that she became so famous, I think she will always remain incredibly famous and an icon for so many people, because she put her money where her mouth was, right? Like, she didn't just believe in certain things and then not actually do anything related to that. Like, I think one of the things that she's particularly known for is as a queer icon, right? And that's because she was bisexual, and that's because in a country that's incredibly conservative now, let alone 60 years ago, 70 years ago, she lived as a bisexual woman. And I think for that reason, the same way that she supported indigenous rights, and the same way that she supported communist ideas, fundamentally with the idea of helping poorer people, for that reason, she will always be incredibly famous amongst so many people. Maybe not so much amongst the generic identity politics individuals of Gen Z and late millennials, who are now moving on to some new icon that they can hashtag about.
Which people don't say anymore. Hashtags are now irrelevant now in the age of AI, but we should continue to ironically say it.
I feel, and this is my sister-in-law calling me out of society. I can hear her calling me out of society because I think hashtags have been out for like a decade, but I don't know.
So, what's your number 3?
My number 3 is actually El Canelo. This is Canelo
Oh, that's a
Alvarez,
good one. Yes.
the great Mexican boxer. Of course, Mexicans as a people are not large people, so this is not a heavyweight champion. I don't think Mexico has had any relevant heavyweight champions, but he has been in welterweight, light middleweight, super middleweight, you name it. But he's incredibly famous in many parts of the world, and I think what's interesting about El Canelo is that he represents Mexican boxing more broadly. And I always knew that boxing was a big deal in Mexico, but I had no idea. I don't know if you know this, but I had no idea that Mexico is generally considered to be the second most important, by far, boxing nation in the world.
Yeah, and for quite a while too, right?
Yes, for decades, like since the '60s, I believe Mexico was Mexico was undoubtedly one of the great titans of boxing, and whereas parts of Eastern Europe which were very important also in boxing, have kind of moved away from that, it remains very important in Mexico. Just to get an idea, El Canelo, not that I'm particularly interested in boxing, but El Canelo made an estimated just from his fights, $110 million in 2023. And of course, he's being paid as a function of how many people are watching these fights, right? So that's a lot of people that are watching these fights. Like the great, winners of the tennis opens, which are very widely seen, make like $3 million, I think, per open. Like this is a completely different scale.
Yeah, and it's also a cultural phenomenon. I remember very clearly that during the last US campaign, there was a very interesting Mexican-American Democratic politician in a Republican constituency. And one of his things during the campaign was to kind of make himself more macho, manly, but in a good way. I don't know how to say it. Basically, sort of like approachable, non-woke leftist, basically. And his big thing was to campaign, have a bit of stake, and to go and watch the big fight. And Canelo was the connecting point between him, his constituency, and his Mexican American identity, because ultimately, that's a lot of what Canelo does. He is a big binational icon, both in Mexico and in the United States. I would argue that's maybe one of the limiting factors of Canelo. I don't actually know how big boxing is on a global scale. It's pretty big, but I know that it's massive in Mexico and massive in the United States.
Yeah, so generally the US is viewed as number one, then Mexico. But then an important player is the Philippines, right? So that gives you access to that sort of Southeast Asian market. Of course, Manny Pacquiao. And then Philippines is, the stronghold of Southeast Asia, but there are many parts or many regions of Southeast Asia that are also interested in boxing. Thailand, famously in kickboxing, but related as well is boxing, and they do watch that as well. The other great nation is Cuba. So it is very much an American phenomenon and more of an East Asian phenomenon, not so much a European or African one.
Former Spanish territorial, former Spanish holdings, United States, Philippines, Cuba, and Mexico.
Exactly, yeah. And I think one of the big drivers of it being so famous in the U.S., which, as you say, Canelo is this sort of cross-border, particularly U.S.-Mexico border icon, is the fact that boxing is particularly important, yes, in a lot of the US, but particularly important in the places where there are a lot of Mexicans. So if you look at a lot of the top US champions in all the categories, basically, a lot of them have Mexican names. The enormous majority of them are first or second generation Mexicans. Well, first or second generation Americans from Mexican parents or grandparents, right? So I think Canelo's not just incredibly famous, but he's politically relevant in a way because he is an icon for this very significant, this very large Latino and, of course, Mexican specifically population in the U.S., which has become so politically relevant in has been for a long time. But let's not forget what's been going on in the past couple of weeks in California.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I feel you've broken your own rule, but in an interesting way, because I don't think Canelo, for the very reasons you've described, being such a binational icon, would count as he's got the depth, right? He's got the massive fan base, but he hasn't got the breadth. I've got the anti-Canelo as my number 2.
All right, let's hear it.
Because Mexicans kind of hate him, and everyone loves him. It's a 1980s, 1990s television show that still runs, even though it hasn't been on the air for years. And it's incredibly famous in Latin America.
Chavo del Ocho?
Yes. Chespirito.
Yeah.
Roberto.
I love Chespirito. I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, lots of So here's a bit of context for non-Latin American listeners. Roberto Gomez Bolaños is a man better known as Chespirito, which I think is a play on Little Shakespeare, Chespirito, Little Shakespearito. And he was a big television personality in the 18s and 90s. Or we'll say an ongoing television personality, because he died a little while ago and he hadn't really been on the air for decades. And yet people fly into Mexico from Peru, Argentina, Brazil, looking for the Chespirito Museum. And it doesn't exist because Mexicans don't care about this guy. It's like if Dallas were really, really big in, I don't know, in Europe, like the TV show Dallas or whatever, and people kept flying to Texas because they're desperate for the TV show museum, and like they want to talk to everyone about the TV show Dallas, and everyone in the US has moved on from this, yes, big moment in television history, but it's completely over now. Generations have passed. And yet, to me, that's what's really important, right? He's a relatively infamous character in Mexico. He's beloved in Latin America. Just a quick anecdote. When I went to Brazil, I could get on a car, not say a word, and this happened to me like 3 times. The cab driver would start talking to me about Chaves, which is the way they call El Chavo del Ocho, one of Chespirito's characters. That's how they call him in Brazil. They call him Chaves. And they think he's Brazilian, even though he's clearly dubbed.
No way.
Yeah,
I did not know that.
And people will sell like gum on the streets dressed up as another of his characters, El Chapulín Colorado. I need people who don't know who this is. I need people who don't know who this is to look this person up, because this is a grown man dressed up in a red leotard and pretending to be a red grasshopper with a little mallet, a red mallet. And people dress it up like this in the streets of Brazil and sell, like gum or like candy on the streets, dressed up as this iconic character, and who's iconic to them as well. But in Mexico, I think people sort of find him a bit embarrassing because it's kind of cheesy humor. It's very much sitcom 1980s humor in the context of the reign of Televisa, Mexico's massive television company that dominated entertainment for decades in the country, and that was very tied to the ruling party back in the 20th century, the PRI, the PRI, which was in very close cahoots with Televisa, and by definition with Chespirito, who came out and had to do stuff with the government, and then eventually in the year 2000 came out and actively supported Vicente Fox, who was the opposition pan-conservative party candidate. But he was an interesting figure because he was quite controversial here, whereas I think he's untainted by that in the rest of Latin America, which makes him a more evergreen product.
My feeling with Chespirito is that I think that might be a very middle class and upper class perspective, whereas the majority of Mexicans, I feel, love Chespirito. Like, I think it's very highbrow to say like, oh no, he's tainted, whereas most people have no idea about them. They're just like, he's amazing, because it's not sophisticated, let's say, humor, but it's pretty funny.
Octavio Figueroa, ladies and gentlemen, the voice of the people, speaking to you straight from Zurich, Switzerland.
No comment.
I mean, you're right, and I think there's a lot of guilty pleasures here, because there's actually a new Netflix series out about it's a biopic about Roberto Gomez Bolaños and the show, the El Chavo del Ocho. And it's I don't know how big or small it's been, but the fact that Netflix thought they should make it, it'd be interesting to see how well it does in Latin America versus here. Because maybe what people want to see is the backstory, the drama, the sort of nitty gritty of what went on behind the scenes in this very Mexican context of the 1980s and 90s.
Yeah, definitely. I think that another thing that's important is that now that's changed quite significantly, and it's continuing to change ever more. But Mexico, in the reign of the PRI, was sort of the king of media for the Spanish-speaking world, right? Like even for many things, for Spain, this is the Franco era for a long time. A lot of the content came from Televisa, and while Televisa is no longer quite as important internationally as it once was, it was sort of the only thing that a lot of people in Latin America could watch, because their own countries weren't actually producing anything of their own. So I think it has this extra weight there that it might not have in Mexico.
And that's still the case, I think. Televisa is no longer the great beast it used to be, but just because of the sheer amount of people in Mexico's still a big cultural media actor. One of the people I thought of putting on the list, but which I didn't, because I don't think he's big enough, is Luisito Comunica, who is massive in Mexico, but not that big elsewhere. He's Mexico's biggest YouTuber, basically, tens of millions of followers. But even beyond him, there's a big debate going on in Spain, in Colombia, about how younger generations have taken up Mexican slang because they're so exposed to Mexican influences.
Yeah, definitely. No, and I remember this as a kid. I was in Bariloche, I think, for New Year's when I was like 10 or something. I remember trying to explain to someone this joke from Chavo del Ocho, and like everyone there was Argentinian. And I said like, well, it's a show. And I started explaining it, and everyone kind of stopped and turned around and said, well, this is El Chavo del Ocho. Like, it was so clear to everyone what I was talking about in a way that it would not have been to many Mexicans.
Yeah. And in a weird little tribute to that, apparently the new and relatively controversial airport north of Mexico City, the AIFA, built in the previous administration after the big Norman Foster airport was cancelled in relatively central Mexico City. It's a controversial airport, but the toilets are famous because they're Chavo del Ocho themed.
I did not know that, and I love that. I will go to those toilets. I'm so excited.
Next one is yours.
So now, on to number 2. My number 2 is El Chapo Guzman.
Ah, very good one.
So I think El Chapo, of course, this is the great leader of the Sinaloa cartel, who's now in prison and has been for quite some time. El Chapo Guzman is one of the most important characters in the Mexican drug industry and, organized crime world. Consequently, one of the most important characters in global organized crime. Some say he still runs things from inside his maximum security prison in the US. I doubt that. But his offspring are still very much active and out and about. And I think the reason El Chapo is particularly famous, not only is he this great sort of kingpin of organized crime, it's in 2018 that we get the first season of Narcos Mexico, right? And Netflix that does reach the entire planet, and everyone starts to. We already had Narcos Colombia. People are sort of already obsessed with this. The world, for some reason, it's beyond me, is sort of obsessed with drug dealers as if they were some sort of heroes. I don't understand it.
It's also the peak of Netflix mania. I think after that you get all these other competitors, but at the time, everyone was on Netflix.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's this thing where Narcos Colombia blew up. But Narcos Colombia is ultimately, at this point, kind of ancient history, right? Whereas Narcos Mexico is talking about stuff that are still very relevant today. The great leaders of organized crime, arguably worldwide, are Mexican and are in Mexico. And El Chapo Guzman is one of the creators of the modern Mexican organized crime ecosystem, let's say. And the fact that his trial was in the US and it was quite public, and he did all these things, like he escaped from like using tunnels, he escaped from maximum security prisons in Mexico multiple times. That's what makes him particularly famous.
And I think the name here is important because ultimately Mexico is infamous worldwide for the drug cartels because that's what most media tends to cover. That's actually the first thing I ever wrote for the Mexico Political Economist, which was the media needed to stop covering only these three aspects of Mexico, which is the stereotype of cartels, cocaine, and Cancun. But that seems to be what sells in foreign outlets, and so that's why the Mexico Political Economist exists. But I think the Netflix series was a game changer for the name recognition of this one cartel leader, because it went from being cartels to El Chapo.
Yep, definitely. Actually, I have to say, it must have started slightly before the first season of Narcos Mexico, because I remember was working in Australia in 2016, the first half of 2016, and Narcos Colombia was already going on. So I think people must have become interested in this, and there was a bunch of news in New York, stemming from New York about his trial. And I'd be walking around Adelaide, not even Sydney, and someone would know that I was from Mexico, and then people would be like, "Oh, of course, El Chapo." I was like, "He's not my friend. Like, I don't know this person. Why are you talking to me about him?" But it was a common thing all over Australia that happened to me. So, I mean, that's pretty far away from Mexico.
Although I will say, this is just me looking at Google Trends again. El Chapo's not a consistently sought after search term, but then again, that doesn't matter because he's so universally known. I think there's an interesting trend with the people we've discussed, which is a bit like Madonna or Bono. If you know someone by their name or their nickname, it means they must be truly famous. There's El Chapo, there's Frida, to a certain extent there's Scheinbaum. I think we've got the final one, which is my number one, because we've done your number one, who is Frida, right?
Indeed, yeah.
And this one, I think lots of really big fans won't even know what his surname is. But number one for me, I think it'll be a controversial one. I think this will be worth chatting about. Number one for me is Luis Miguel.
Yes, 100%. I love it.
Yeah. So this is going to be weird because I've just mentioned a name and now I'm going to have to explain it to a lot of people who have no idea who this person is, especially in the English-speaking world. Remember, when I said fame, it was about depth and breadth. And Luis Miguel is an interesting animal. He is Mexico's most famous singer and has been for a while. But what's interesting to me is that he's got the perfect combination. He's not incredibly wide because he's mostly known in Spanish-speaking countries. He's a singer after all. He's sort of part of the Hispanic cultural baggage. But the depth is just deeper than the Mariana Trench. Like, this man is beloved in a way that I can't describe. Bit of context. Luis Miguel, let's do a classic social media thing. Let's ask our viewers to comment what the surname of this man is, because I think that's a really interesting thing that most people probably have no idea. Luis Miguel is his first two names. Miguel isn't his first name. But he's basically a man who became a classic 80s pop star in Mexico in the 1980s, very much pushed by his father. In the 1990s, he becomes a big sort of icon, a sex icon. People love him. And then he has an interesting pivot in the 2000s when he starts sort of losing steam. He becomes an older gentleman, and he pivots into what I think is the reason he's so consistently big, which is he pivots into Mexican traditional music. And from the 2000s onwards, a lot of the traditional music you'll hear in restaurants and stuff will be sung by Luis Miguel. Very suave, incredibly good looking, and an icon until I'd say the 2010s or something. And then he disappeared for like a decade. And then it's Netflix again. So I think there's another trend here. Netflix revives him.
Mind you, like, he disappears, I think, from the Mexican or Mexico City.
Personally disappears, you're right, yes. Because he's still very much present.
Yes, like, if you go to... let's be fair, this is a Mexico, like, central Mexico thing. If you go to the north of Mexico, they don't particularly like him that much, but they all know who he is. But what must be said is all of, like, the 2010s, he's making millions in Las Vegas. And, like, he's filling entire venues every single day. I think he's making something like $1 million a day. It's something outrageous for years, without any new material. It's extraordinary.
Although he's a classic case, right? Like Elvis, like all these greats before him, loads of money, he blows it all, and he ends up in enormous debt, which is why in the 2010s, there start to be rumors, and I remember I actually mentioned this to you when I saw the trailer, because the trailer wasn't like he was clearly fishing for clients, because it was literally him. It wasn't an actor saying, I'm going to tell you all the real story about my life coming soon. And it was basically because the man had gotten himself into so much debt that he needed another cash cow to get out of the debt in the first place. And so what you get is a revival in 2018 with another biopic, the Luis Miguel La Serie, Luis Miguel the series, which I'm going to confess to you now, Tavo, is more or less what the thinking behind the title for this podcast. Luis Miguel the series brings him back to life and back into the public view. And one would think, especially comparing it to El Chavo, Chespirito's biopic that we're seeing right now, it was incredible, like the reception that series got. It was a cultural icon. Like, I can't remember it like before or since. It was the last time I truly experienced appointment television, even in the age of the internet, because it was streamed, one episode streamed every week on Netflix in Mexico. And you had to watch it live, basically, because people would tweet out spoilers, and like it would just become an inside joke immediately as soon as it aired. And so like it's the last time I remember it being like appointment television in the old school way. And people talked about it, and it was just a massive rage, which led on to a new series of tours that Luis Miguel started doing, because he came out of hiding, because he had been hiding for a while after the Las Vegas stage of his life. And then he branched out. And what I think is really important about this whole story is that he didn't actually launch the tour from Mexico City. He started in Buenos Aires, and I think most of the concerts happened in the United States. And he's famous in Italy. I know you know that he sings songs in Italian, classic Italian pop songs sung in Italian by a Mexican. And ultimately, I think he is, in terms of the depth, the amount of fans he's got, and the breadth in Latin America, like El Chavo, but also in the United States, like El Canelo, and in Spain, and in Italy, and across the world, across maybe a smaller audience. I think he is, at least currently, the most famous Mexican that maybe most of our English-speaking audience will have no idea existed.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because when you, as you say, breadth and depth, for me, Frida Kahlo is a face that everyone has seen. Or I don't know if everyone, but I've seen her stuff pretty widely, like in Argentina, in Japan, in Australia, in Europe, in the US. Whereas I'm certain that if I go to a random person in France, they'll have no idea who Luis Miguel is, and will have never seen a picture of him. However, the people who know Frida Kahlo sort of worldwide, the majority of them might not even know she's Mexican. So sure, she's a famous Mexican. But the people who know Luis Miguel kind of would die for Luis Miguel. Even the people who pretend they wouldn't. And to your point about the Netflix series, I remember when it came out, I remember like it, I don't know, coming back from the weekend and be Monday, and grown men being like, "Did you watch it? That was amazing! Like, what is this? It's an obsession that this man is followed by."
And he's incredibly representative of Mexico in lots of ways, right? He's an icon of the fresas. Listen to that podcast. I'll link it in the show notes. But like, he is an icon of this insufferable Mexican aristocracy that Tavo and I spoke about in a previous podcast, probably our most beloved podcast so far, actually, episode that is. And fascinatingly, and maybe we can close with this, he's known as El Sol de Mexico, the shining sun of Mexico. But really, in terms of like the Donald Trump way of seeing things, he's not even Mexican. He's half Spanish, half Italian, born in Puerto Rico, and yet he's become the epitome of Mexico, which I think is a really beautiful thing. I'd love to end on a quote by Chavela Vargas, who was a very famous Mexican singer who sang classic Mexican songs. And
a lover of Frida Kahlo.
And a lover, maybe somewhat literally, yes. More than most people are lovers of Frida Kahlo. Chavela Vargas was very much a lover of Frida Kahlo. Let us end with this quote from Chavela Vargas representing Ruiz Miguel herself because she was born in Costa Rica and so much of Mexican culture and people as we know it. When she was asked by a journalist once why she'd called herself a Mexican if she was born in Costa Rica, her answer immediately was, a Mexican can be born wherever the fuck they want.
Un mexicano nace donde se le da la chingada gana.
Well, that was that from this episode of Mexico, the podcast. If you want to support us, please do subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist, link in the show notes. I am Alex Gonzalez Ormerod, Mexico's 100 millionth most famous Mexican.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa. Thank you for listening.